Hello and welcome to the video and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're going to look at the main battle tanks, or MBTs as they are sometimes called, and cruiser tanks from the British Army. From World War I, from the birth of tank warfare right up to today's modern tanks. We are looking at the largest tanks that were used. Now I understand and I know that a lot of smaller tanks were produced and used during the wars and after, but we are not covering those today. We could do that in a future video. We are also looking at tanks that were designed in the UK, so tanks from other nations are not on this list. You won't find any Shermans, Stuarts or Lees in this list, as they were given to the UK by the USA on the Lend-Lease plan. Some numbers for production runs are estimates, as the actual information is difficult to find. This is because the later tanks are still in use in some countries, even though they were designed in the 60s. So, let's get on with the list. The importance of tanks was first realised in World War I. They allowed the army that had them at their disposal to cover land in hours that used to take months to fight over. One of the first tanks, and one of the most recognisable ones of the Great War, was the Mark I tank. It featured two sets of tracks on either side of the body, and most resembles the tanks we know today. They originally came fitted with 6-pounder guns on either side and sponsons. There were different variations on this, with some having flamethrowers or higher caliber rifles fitted instead. They were not the fastest thing on the battlefield, a horse could outrun them, but they could take a lot of damage and allow the army to drive right over the trenches, rather than having to be involved in rather violent hand-to-hand combat. The Mark I wasn't massively reliable, but was improved upon as the war went on, and increased in reliability and armament. In total, roughly 1,000 were built, from 1916 to the end of the war in 1919, starting with the Mark I in 1916 and ending with the Mark X in 1919. In the interwar period, the British Army focused on smaller, medium tanks, as they wanted speed and mobility rather than being able to take a hit. This changed as World War II started, as the German tanks could hit as hard as they could get hit. The British Army had to develop a new MBT, and fast. The first design the British came up with was the Crusader, or Cruiser Mark I. It was relatively lightly armoured, but was quick for its size. The Mark I and Mark II used a 2-pounder 40mm gun. This was underpowered against the German tanks. When the Mark III was rolled out, it had a much better 6-pounder 57mm gun. This was more than a match for the German tanks it faced. But there was an unfortunate trade-off, as the tank now had a bigger gun and more armour, which slowed it down somewhat. The Crusader was produced up until 1942, as there were delays of its predecessor. More about that in a minute. They built roughly 5,300 of this model. The next design they brought out was the Covenanter. Design and building started in 1940, but as they built them they realised there were terrible design flaws. The engine was prone to overheating and they decided not to send any into war zones. They kept them in the UK to train the troops and use them for target practice once they were not needed anymore. The Covenanter had a 40mm 2-pounder gun. Despite the tank not being used in battle because it wasn't suited to warmer climates, they still made 1,771, although very few of these are left now. There's one on display at Bovington Tank Museum. In 1941, the Army unveiled the Churchill. Now the Mark I Churchill only came with a 2-pounder, as did the Mark II, but later tanks got much bigger cannons. The Mark III got a 6-pounder, the Mark VI got a 75mm, and the Mark VIII got a 95mm. Towards the end of the war, the Churchill proved itself as a strong, hard-hitting tank. It could go over nearly any terrain, so it was very useful for fighting through the hedgerows and fields of Western Europe. They built roughly 5,640 of these tanks over the course of its run. The next tank they built after the failure of the Covenanter was the Cavalier in 1942. It was a stopgap tank designed to get something out into the field and allow them to test designs that were used on other tanks later on. Cavalier had a 6-pounder gun and was used to improve on the Churchill tank. Only 500 were built as the Churchill was proving itself in battles. Another tank that was seen as a temporary measure was the Challenger. It was produced in 1942 as a faster and less armoured Churchill. It was fitted with the now usual armament of a 75mm gun. They only produced 200 units. I'm not too sure why every tank in the British Army seems to start with a C. I can't find anything to explain it, but let's continue with the list anyway. In 1944, the Senator and Cromwell were put into service. The two tanks are very similar looking and had the same 75mm. The main difference between the tanks was the power plant. The Senator has the 410 horsepower Liberty engine, and the Cromwell came with a more powerful 600 horsepower Meteor engine. Both of these tanks, they built roughly 4,000, 1,600. It's not known how many of each were produced, as they were very, very similar. One of the last designs that the British Army released before the end of the war was the Comet in 1944. The tank was an improvement on the Cromwell design and was fitted with a very effective 77mm high velocity gun. It was very good against the Panther and Tiger tanks at medium range and was considered the best tank produced by the British during the war. Once the Second World War was finished and won, the British Army decided to continue the development of cruiser tanks, or MBTs. In 1945, the Centurion tank was shown off. It was designed to go toe-to-toe with any Soviet tanks, as the Cold War has just started with the division of Berlin. The tank featured a 105mm rifled barrel. It was sold to many different countries around the world and was used right up to the present day. Although these models have gone through heavy modifications and updates to keep up with the newer tanks, they built roughly 4,423. As the Cold War rolled on, each side developed new technologies and released better and better armoured tanks. The UK developed the Conqueror in 1965. The tank featured a 120mm rifled barrel, a feature that would become common sight on most MBTs from around the world. 185 units were produced as the next evolution came along only a year later. One year later, the Chieftain was entered into service. It had the now normal 120mm rifled barrel. It was an all-round improvement on the Conqueror and was sold all over the world. Because it was sold all over the world, it is nearly impossible to work out how many have been built, as the figures have been kept quiet. The Chieftain was the UK's main battle tank until 1983, when the Challenger 1 was rolled off the production line, not to be confused with the Challenger from World War II. The Challenger saw action in the first Gulf War and other difficult terrains and proved itself to be a very, very good tank. It was fitted with, yep, you guessed it, a 120mm rifled barrel. Roughly 420 were built. 392 of the tanks were sold off to Jordan. Most are still in service with them, but are soon to be phased out. In 1998, the Challenger 2 was unveiled. It is the current tank being used by the British Army and others over the world. It features the typical 120mm rifled barrel. So far, 447 of them built. One of the most impressive things about the Challenger 2 is it has never been destroyed in operations by the enemy. There has been one unfortunate case of one being destroyed by friendly fire. As of this year, the British Army has not replaced the Challenger 2. With no massive wars going on and hopefully none to kick off, it's seen as easier to keep the current fleet running than to spend millions of pounds to create and design a new main battle tank that might not be needed. Thank you for watching to the end. Leave a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. We have plans to get more videos out over the coming weeks, including one on the history of a very popular video game series. I hope you're having a good day and I hope to see you again here soon. Take care and goodbye.